Well, I've already been introduced by Victoria. I teach at Renison University College, and I teach literature and the environment, which is how this reading came about today. I'd like to thank the Canada Council and Writers Union of Canada, first of all, for funding today's virtual reading, which is co-sponsored by Renison and the Laura Poetry Center and Gallery. In particular, I would like to thank Victoria Feth of the Center for Teaching Excellence for her usual professional guidance. When she says she helps me out, she saves me all the time. I'm eternally grateful for her help. I feel so comfortable doing something like this when I know she's hovering there in the background. Also like to thank Carol Williams, Luke Hill, and Nancy Schnarr for publicizing this event. And most of all, of course, I want to thank Karen Houle for agreeing to this reading. We were so excited when she consented to do it. Professor Houle has roots in Northern Ontario. Singer-songwriter Catherine Wheatley actually claims that Karen has a North Bay accent. I don't know how she feels about that. But she's made Guelph her home ground for a long time, receiving all three of her degrees from U of G. She did her undergraduate work in biology and chemistry, her master's in history and philosophy of science, and her doctorate in political philosophy. You've probably gathered by now that Karen Houle is a polymath. She's now a full professor at the University of Guelph. Her areas of specialization including political theory, ethics, environmental philosophy, philosophy and literature, and feminist thought. And she has published on a whole slew of philosophers and subjects ranging from reproductive technology to friendship. And I see she's even supervised a doctoral dissertation on that subject. Prior to the publication of the Grand River Watershed, a folk ecology, which was a finalist for the Governor General's Award in 2019, Professor Houle published two other books of poetry. The first was Ballast, published by House of Anansi in 2000. It was nominated for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award, which is an award through the League of Canadian Poets for a first book of poetry by a Canadian writer. And then in 2005, she published During, which like the Grand River Watershed was published by Gasborough Press, which describes it as, quote, a study of continuity, of being in process, and of seeing through, depicting friendships, siblings, marriage, parenting, breakups, work and loss through the oblique angles of biology, geology, forestry, and philosophy. I'm going to leave it to Karen to talk about her poetics as we get into things, but I just wanted to take up a couple minutes here by introducing her reading through a couple of things, if you'll bear with me. The first is what William Ruckert, who's considered the father of eco-criticism, had to say about poetry. And I just, when I read this, thought of Karen Houle's poetry, so I thought it's very short. He says, a poem is stored energy, a formal turbulence, a living thing, a swirl in the flow. Poems are part of the energy pathways that sustain life. Poems are a verbal equivalent of fossil fuel, stored energy, but they are a renewable source of energy, coming as they do from those two ever-generative twin matrices, language and imagination. In an article on Karen's time as inaugural writer in residence at the Rare Charitable Research Reserve in fall 2014, which I'm also going to leave to her to tell you all about. Laura McDonald published an article where she interviewed Karen about Karen's needing to go outside all the time. She was living at North House, which is this high-tech, solar-powered eco-dwelling that was designed by the students and architectural staff of U of W, Ryerson, and Simon Fraser. It had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. So these features, Karen reports, allowed no privacy indoors. So she spent most of her time, this was fall, remember, although I understand it snowed at the end of everything. Mm-hmm. But she spent her time outdoors, and she said that this was perfectly suited to her kinetic writing process. I'm going to quote her, which is kind of strange when she's right here, but what the heck. She said, any poem I've ever written, I first had to move my body. Mm-hmm. Things around you are moving at different paces, so you get this syncopated feeling. I guess that's called parallax. There's a rhythm that can start happening. Mm. And ultimately, poetry is about words jumping into that rhythm. She goes on to say that eventually a poem would knit itself together, a wonderful metaphor. I think that's what they call the muse, she adds to that. So the last thing I want to mention is that this course, or this reading, is in conjunction with the course I'm teaching, Literature for an Ailing Planet. And we're talking a lot about bioregionalism, and that's one of the reasons that I immediately thought of inviting Karen for this event. Peter Berg defines bioregions as geographic areas having common characteristics of soil, watersheds, climate, and native plants and animals that exist with the whole planetary biosphere as unique and intrinsic contributive parts. In Luke Hill's interview with Karen Houle, she remarked of the Grand River watershed, the book is running 2 epistemic registers together, the folksy and the scientific, because they are both there. And when together, joined, careful joinery in poetics can give us a feeling for the watershed. Finally, the writer Jim Dodge adds that a different criterion for marking bioregional distinctions is cultural phenomenological. You are where you perceive you are. Your turf is what you think it is, individually and collectively. One of the most provocative ideas to delineate bioregions is in terms of spirit place, or psyche, tuned power presences. And this is as good a lead-in as I could come up with for today's reading. So I think now hand things over to Karen. Thank you.
I think that deserves a really nice applause. That was absolutely wonderful, Daniel. People learned a lot about the writing and my process and my history as a writer, and also just connection to regions from that. So thank you so much. So one thing I don't know if Victoria or Daniel mentioned, but we actually have quite a bit of time today. Often when you go to poetry readings in person, or even with recent versions of online festivals, the readers have sometimes 15 or 20 minutes, which is generous and wonderful, but we actually have quite a bit of time today. So rather than just be a one-way transmission conduit of my poems into your ears, or however it is that you're receiving them, what would be really pleasing for me, and I think for Daniel, because this is being orchestrated in the context of some students and some learning, is I would like to learn alongside you and ask questions of you about your reception of this book, about experiences with reading poetry, things that matter to me that I'd like to bounce off the audience. And of course, you can ask questions of me as well, but it would be really wonderful if we could get some sort of collective thinking on some important points because we have the time for it today. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm moving fairly slow these days. I don't know if my normal pace was too frenetic, and this is actually the pace that we should be doing things at. I trust most people are moving a bit more slowly, or I'm not sure if I'm just being like a lazy sloth and embracing hibernation. But. So we have time and we can go slowly. You can hear me okay, Daniel? I can just see Daniel, but great. The other thing is I want to say something about land acknowledgements. Many of you, especially in the Canadian context or the North American context, have experienced and noticed that probably in the last year or 2 years at most, it's become perfunctory almost to give a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the opening of any kind of gathering. And I've had some rather sort of distressing experiences of those acknowledgements lately where it feels as though, let's say the meeting was about city waste and 20 minutes of the meeting was taken in the formalities of a land acknowledgement, but then, sort of out of the way and we went on to talk about waste as though these two parts are not connected. And so that's alarming because I take it that the spirit of land acknowledgement is to be awake and to notice that the histories of this place were rarely taught, but they're still with us. And I also wanted to invite us all to be imaginative and creative and even bold and courageous in thinking about the various forms and the various forms and chords and rhythms that a land acknowledgement could actually appear in that would carry the spirit, the intended spirit with it. And I feel as though the intended spirit is for us to say, we are here and we're here together and we're here by virtue of what came before us. And that's true at the level of language and words, and the preservation of texts and the loss of texts. And it's also true at the level of trees and the preservation of trees and species and their loss. So what remains today, including us and our ability to be together and think and try and sleep, is ode of gratitude to the peoples and the beings and the efforts that came before us. And wherever we are in the world, that's going to be a different collection of histories. And maybe I don't have to say it, but I'd like to say in my own way, this book is a land acknowledgement. This book is the spirit of trying to come to grips with the fact that there's a place where I live and it's got particularities that maybe I owe it to them to become acquainted with and to mirror back with a kind of sense of gratitude and wonder and sort of praise in my own secular way. So this is a land acknowledgement and it doesn't stop when I start reading the poems. So I'd like to say that first. The other thing is, if you have any requests, I'm happy to entertain them. Oh, and thanks to everybody. This is the first time I've worn lipstick in about 2 months, so it's pretty exciting. So the first poem that I'm going to read today is called Fall Asters. And if you have the book with you, it's on page 51. I also want to say, you can receive poetry however you receive it. Some people close their eyes, some people lay in the dark. Some people tap it out in rhythms. It's a kind of a wonderful thing that this virtual event allows us to do that, because it can be super awkward at poetry readings for the reader and for the audience, because they don't quite know where to look, or maybe they're feeling the energy and they want to move their body in a certain way, but we have to sit on those chairs. So it's wonderful. You can just get into whatever posture and whatever mindset you need to just be taking in what's coming from this book to you. So a couple things that maybe would help with this poem. Folks who live in this bioregion will know what the fall asters are. So fall asters are a magnificent plant, and they bloom alongside goldenrod. Goldenrod's different shades of yellow, and the fall asters around here are white and purple, but predominantly purple. And it's unbelievable in late fall, when the frost is really imminent, to look across some fields and they're just absolutely on fire with bright purple and yellow is kind of wondrous. It's one of the wondrous things. So it's a pleasure on the eye, the fall asters. But also from the perspective of ecology, they turn out to be the last food that the pollinators can get before the cold hits. So it's also crucial that we respect them and leave space for them and don't spray them and don't cut them down, because the bees and the overwintering bees and the honeybees, that's the last treat they're going to get. So they need the flowers too. This poem, in fact, I hope that we can open it up for a few questions after. And you don't know me well enough. Some of you know me very, very well. Some of you don't know me at all. But I love questions and I'm really curious. And so I'm curious about what you're curious about. And so I'm absolutely open to hearing any responses or questions you have about this. And some of these are pretty vulnerable. This one in particular is not about me directly, but it is about a condition. It is about a condition of being vulnerable, particularly reproductive vulnerability. I know lots of people who, it's slightly different story for men and women in different ways, but I know lots of women who would have liked to have born a child and weren't able to for a zillion reasons. Sometimes they're medical reasons, sometimes they're reasons of economics. They're just starting a job around the same time that it would have maybe made sense to have a child. Or that never happened and you had a job here and a job there and a job there, and then you lost your job and then the window closes. And the worries about other factors like birth defects and just like difficulties in pregnancy start to really matter. And the thing that's just the truth of the matter. That's reality, and it sometimes ends up tragically and sometimes it adds up triumphantly. But what's underneath all of that for me, that isn't just about women, but it's about all of us, is that we have dependencies, that we depend on something else in the world to make something happen for ourselves. And getting pregnant is an example of that. And it means that we're not ultimately sovereign beings when we have dreams to be something or to do something or to have a child or to not have a child, because that's also a dream. We find that the external reality is either not available on the time that we want it, or what does the Buddha say? The two sufferings are having the thing that you don't want and wanting the thing that you don't have. And it speaks to the fact that there's a limit to how much we can push the world to do what we want it to do when we want it to do it. And that's true of all of us in small and large ways. And then what really matters, I think, is how we bear that, how we bear the fact that there are dependencies that sometimes we just would rather not, were not true. So the spirit of this poem is to try to speak to the fact that those dependencies run across all the kingdoms, which might be a point for compassion. For me, it's definitely a point for compassion. And hi, Michael. And just the different ways that we can notice that in other lives that seem very, very different than ours, like in the lives of fall asters. There's one other clarification. There's a word in here, a technical word. It's called apomictic. And my apologies to the botanists in the room. But apomictic, which I had to look up myself, apomictic means you can self-fertilize. So there's plants that have male and female on the same plant, sometimes the same branch, and fertility can happen because the pollen from the male can actually enter the female parts of that plant and it can become fertilized. So I don't know how plants do it. They're miracles. But so they are dependent, but they have a sort of better chance of things working out because the pollen zone is very close to where it needs to be. But then other plants are called non-apomictic, and that just means that they can't self-fertilize. Okay, they have to be pollinated by a different species altogether. All right. Fall asters, Symphotrichum cordifolium. If she came back as a flowering plant, she would come back as a fall aster. Not that she would. She was stubborn in all matters, especially in the matter of Christ, keen on getting to him and staying put. At her memorial service, a pew rammed with high rationalists received her pre-selection of hymns and a posthumous talking to on the true nature of nature. Quote, that all things are beyond our control and understanding, that they have a higher logic, which is not ours to question. In which case she just might reappear one day in a field as an aster, a purple that knows how to stand next to yellow so that its plainness is unthinkable. The charismatic, flowering layer of life is not just good to look at, not just a smell trick to lure the menfolk with. It's cryptic attraction pulling the strings of the flying things, included but not limited to bees, flies, sweat flies, butterflies, beetles, bats, and birds. Puny, airborne, pollen-basted bodies, dust-blasted the entire terrestrial system. The flowering plants, and aster too, form the trophic basis of productivity. Take this bread. By Michaelmas, she was out along the waste edge of Sparrowfield, and she was still purple and self-incompatible. The body refusing itself. The body refusing itself, impossible to spot until it shows as sterility or a failed operation. I couldn't see in the glare of her confidence in a life with Jesus. My father's house has many mansions, etc. Squinting into the big cloud days of summer, every inch of my eye space thrummed with goldenrod and asteraceae, waiting for the very thing that was already happening to them. All the kingdoms craving life among life, craving withness, and of a two, to form one clean edge to join, a join like winter fields meet winter's sleek gray sky. But asters are a flower that, to make another flower, relies on something other than a flower. A vector, a little inconvenience, a winged thing. A winged thing that takes a bit of her and carries it to a hole in another. The aster can't do herself. Most other flowering plants can. Some animals can. Pride and independence, these are the ordinary dreams of all the kingdoms. Except in the kingdom of God, was the take-home message from that funeral thesis. Asters can't do it. Not with the wind. Most other flowering plants can. Flowers that, to make another flower out of themselves, they fuck the moving air. Its boom, whisper, lifts their heart-shaped hairy parts, and it's done with. But she depended, obligate. And while she was waiting, the end came. Like October rain, it knocked all of autumn to the ground. She suffered a permanent need, including but not limited to bees, flies, butterflies, beetles, bats, and birds. Any of the 43 kinds of bees would do, or weevils, or tree crickets even, with their clinging leg hairs and crushing mouth parts, which they take promptly and directly to her soft parts. There's a coaxing, there's a little sing-song voice, there's the as yet unreceptive pistil. There's the not small matter of acceptance across an open mouth, the forms of trust, a private matter between you and not you. And we had communion right there on the wooden bench, swallowing the bread body of our Savior down, not touching the teeth. In moments like these, your future is someone else's making. Victoria, anybody want to pop in or say anything or ask anything?
Yes, we have a question from Peter, who actually requested this poem right at the beginning. So that was great that you ended up starting with it. And he quotes, "If she came back as a flowering plant, she would come back as a fall aster," and wonders if this is about a specific person, as he had assumed that it was.
Yes, it's about a specific person. And a particular person of which there's like no other and never will be another like this person. It's a female. And what's relevant is she was a philosopher, she was a logician, she was a high rationalist, she was one of us on the bench. And I had no idea whatsoever that she had this dimension of spirituality and belief in the afterlife with God. I didn't know that about her. It was a sort of shock, a sort of mystery to try to square the fact of the person that I thought I knew with this truth about herself that she was delivering after we could had any chance of debating about it, which I thought was kind of sweet. And so I just stayed with that for the longest time. The seeming incommensurability of a deep belief in God and high rationalism is one thing. Not that it was hidden, but just the seeming incommensurabilities that we have inside of us that turn out to be, at some level, to me, similar to the fact that a flowering plant needs something other than a flowering plant to become another flowering plant, something that's not it, that seems like it should be incommensurate, but in fact is this, it knits together. And the other thing is, it's a person also that was, she had told me that that once upon a time she wanted to have children, and then when that was looking like it wasn't going to work out, she had to regroup. And so it's a truth that I know. I know many women that wanted kids, could have them, and not lots of women I know that had children and later really regretted that. Is true. And there's some stories that I know with the men folk too, but the particular one about having just a few years in which you could imagine even becoming pregnant, and how different that is from maybe other times or different ways of having a relationship with your body. Seems like a great cost.
Oh, that was a very vulnerable poem and beautiful reading. So thank you for sharing that with us. We do have a couple more questions about it. So Susanna, coming from Salt Spring Island, is asking, if you were a plant, if you were to come back as a plant, what would it be?
Susanna, can I tell you what Ann Carson said? Ann Carson said she's going to come back as bulrushes, which I never forgot that. I asked her, and but if I came back as a plant, I'm going to say it's a birch tree. This is when I'm up, there's different forest combinations, different woods all over. And, you know, you can be in the Sitka spruce, and you can be in a tamarack forest. You can be in a Joshua tree forest or saguaro cactus forest. And there's something about when I'm in the boreal forest and it's marked with good stands of birch of different ages that I can't even describe it, but I feel more at home in that woods than I do in any other woods. And so there's something about birch that is important to me. I don't know what it is. I gathered birch yesterday with Cade in the Arboretum, and we were going to make some little fire starter things, but also Bjork, right? If you're a lover of Bjork, which is birch, then it's a natural choice. Beautiful to see your face, Susanna.
Thanks for popping on, Susanna. And anybody else who wants to ask Karen a question and is comfortable indicating it that way, if I see you pop up at the top, I will be sure to unmute you. That's a cool one. What plant would you be? I feel like that's like a prompt to think about a poem to write for any fledgling poets who might be listening. So we do have another, Susanna added in the chat, I knew it would be a tree.
And since it's a tree, then it's also going to be mycelia. And since it's mycelia, it's going to be a little bit of everything. And so the answer is kind of everything.
That's lovely. So we have a question from Ishani, who asks, how did you strike a balance between empirical, science, religion, and spirituality as you did so wonderfully in this poem? Was there a method, or did the implementation of ecology come after the purely lyrical was written down?
There's lots in there. I'll thank you for the question. So it's a question about methodology, and everybody who writes, whether you're writing philosophy or poetry or journalistic essays or writing music, you have your own methods. The one thing I can answer is I think that all of those are areas of interest to me. Daniel called me a polymath, but it's more like I'm a polyheart. Like there's whatever my fingers or my hand touches or my eye touches, I can find interesting and worth spending some time getting to know. So I'm a philosopher now, so that means that I'm good at logic and being comfortable with speculation, which is really sort of the opposite of qualitative or quantitative research, which is trying to come to some non-speculative conclusion. But I also like that sometimes, landing on something that feels right and good or strong enough or certain enough. So one answer that I'm giving you is that I think I have all of those patterns of meaning making inside me, or they resonate with me. I'm not interested in rejecting empiricism, being a scientist, research methods, studying hard, learning the incredible minutia of a very particular corner of a very particular part of the universe is an incredible kind of vocation. And I did some of it, and enough to learn the style and the cadence and the way that information like moves around, but also back away from it. And the same is true of philosophy, but I sort of back away from philosophy. And the same is true of religion or spirituality, but I back away from it. So it's almost like there's different parts of me, and they keep moving around and sort of landing on different idioms. And so that's why it feels like a weaving, I think, rather than just monochrome. And it's difficult to weave these things together and have them feel like they make sense overall. And poetry, happily, is like a medium that can do that, that can put things together in like very careful constructions without the whole thing falling apart. So, let me just add, it's not a great full answer. I've written 2 articles about my particular poetic methodology, this book, and I'll pass it along to Victoria after. One of them came out in a book on ecology and culture in France last year. And I talk a lot about just there having to be a fit between the kind of interests you have in the world and the interests you have in your heart. And then there's a couple other pieces where people have followed up on different parts about science mixing with ecology, mixing with spirituality, mixing with an intensely personal anecdote. So I'll send you those links if you want to pursue that. But I can also say, just find your own method. Find the method that, even if it seems idiosyncratic and maybe impossible, just stick with it. You'll find a way to put those together. You will. Okay. Your call, Victoria. Another question, or should I read now?
There are no further questions in the chat at this time, so I think it's a great idea to move on to another reading. Yeah.
Are there any other requests?
There was one from the same person looking for hunter-gatherer.
Oh, hunter-gatherer. Michael, can you turn your screen off? I love seeing you, but you're the only one I can see. Oh, it's all right. He's not even live. I see it now. Hunter-gatherer. Let me find it. Oh, something I wanted to tell you guys is a tradition of mine when I read is I have my own book, and then at readings I get folks who are at my readings to sign it, because people come up to me and ask me to sign their books, and I say, okay, only if you sign mine. So I'm not sure how we're going to work this out in this case, but maybe I'll get a list of participants from Daniel and Victoria, and then I'll put them in myself. But it's actually such a pleasure to see the handwriting of folks. Hunter-gatherer. Okay, let me orient those of you that need an orientation to this with a few important facts. So one fact that you're going to hear is the word Frilton. And Frilton is a small town about halfway between Guelph and Hamilton, which is directly south. And if I kept going to the east, I'd bump into Toronto. So if you can picture Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, roughly 2 gigantic inland seas, there's a small section between, and Guelph and Hamilton sit about that far apart, and right in the middle of Frilton. So why that's important is that when you think back 100, 200, 500, 10,000 years ago, movements of people and birds and creatures was heavily dependent on the lake system. You move from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario up through that small, narrow section. You can't portage it, I think you'd probably die, but Frilton is there. Right now, in the present day, Frilton is, Monique can probably answer this because she has to drive by it all the time. It's a set of stoplights. There's a Tim Hortons. You can get gas. There's a place that you can buy Chinese vegetables and some compost, and there's some horse barns, and then you're on the way again. But there is a big antique barn there. Sometimes in this part of the world, they're called flea markets. In France, they're called vide-grenier, attic emptying. In Quebec, des marchés aux puces, which is like flea markets. And so you can and some people hate those, and they start to sneeze and they have to run away because they're so claustrophobic. And I'm the kind of person that just loves rummaging. So this poem is largely actually about this gesture of looking for something. looking for something in the dark, feeling for, like if I'm at Value Village, I can go like this, and then I can find the silk. But you have to feel. So it's rummaging, kind of gathering up. And the focus on this is about objects and the touch of one's hand to objects. Say more in a little. But one thing that I learned when I was at Rare, and I was working quite a bit with an archaeologist named John MacDonald, because I was very interested in the archaeological records in the Grand River watershed. Which tribes had been here, at what times, were they settlements, were they passing through? Is there evidence of slave trading? Where did the sort of main intertribal conflicts happen prior to contact, prior to European contact, or just around the time of contact? Which in Canada is the early 17th century, where you start to have, you know, the explorers that we learned, the great explorers that we learned in probably in grade school, Samuel de Champlain and Jacques Cartier. They actually made inland. They came as far as, they came inland by the Great Lakes. And they traveled often with Jesuit missionaries, no surprise. Jesuit missionaries trying to convert the heathens to Catholicism. And I think when I was in grade 6, I got completely obsessed with the Jesuits and read the Jesuit Relations. And the Jesuit Relations are, it's this large set of texts that are the letters that were sent by the Jesuits who were here in North America back to France to report on their travels and who they had met and where they had met and how many of this and how many of that. So it's an incredible archaeological record. It also lists foods and trees, and there's maps of canoe routes because they were doing all of this in canoes. And I think the original Jesuit records now are in the Supreme Court Library in Ottawa, but they're real, and you see something of the pre or early contact times in this part of the world because there were missionaries and tradesfolk coming through this area. So a little bit to the north of where we live right now, it's called the Lake Huron is up there, but the area of the territories of the peoples of the Wendats, that area would have been called Huronia. And it's the area that the French were actually trading with for the most part. And from the south coming up, there was more trade with the British and the Dutch and the First Nations people. So you can imagine with all that action going through a very small isthmus of land that there are tons and tons of debris, artifacts, things left behind, things destroyed. It's a very thick kind of debris area. And one of the things that I learned from John is that there were, how do I put this right? It is the case that, first of all, not very many sites were able to be identified and then sort of preserved from development or highways or buildings in order to find the artifacts. So there's that there are rich artifact areas that have probably now been paved under, and the Tim Hortons is on top of them. But also when there were a number of very, very important sites that the Ontario Archaeological Society had worked with to preserve in order to do a complete dig, there were massive thefts. There were massive thefts of valuable artifacts from those areas. And in some cases, the archaeologists themselves were guilty of the thefts. They cleaned out some of the valuable stuff in the night, sold it on the black market, and then sort of continued by light of day to carry out the archaeological dig. So that was sort of surprising, but not surprising. And it turned out to be true in this one site, which is called the Frilton Site. All right. Hunter-gatherer. Objects have mass, which is not so much weight as it is the resistance to being moved around in the universe. Lake Erie to Lake Ontario's diagonal slide is the north-south number 6 highway. At its midpoint, the Frilton Flea Market squats on a rutted dirt bump. Treasure hunters, walking with their eyes, meander this double-decker, no-heat emporium of extra weird, floor-to-ceiling accumulation of a lifetime of companions bought or sold. Relics of delight, estate auction spores, boxed lots, go for broke end of season bidding wars, what was handed down, what the barrister doled out among the siblings, what a rained out garage sale abandoned at curbside gets you. A headlamp, a metal detector, a black cassocks button with an iron eye. Every axe gone missing. Shoveling, stolen, or lifted, as we like to say. The Frilton Site, Borden number AIHA-14, approximately 1.25 hectares in size. West Flamborough Township, Regional Municipality of Hamilton Wentworth, see Figure 1. The Attawandaron Nation once lived exactly there. The village of Kiowatea, 1712. The village was large enough for the Jesuits to have visited on their fishing expedition into the deep pockets of Huronia, coughing up one bead after another. Trolling for converts, they bagged a windfall of Wenro refugees from upstate New York. And the deal goes down. Quick wrist, a trinket into one hand, some money out the other, and the wallet flick, jackknifing halfway to baptismal spirit slots where convulsions are hiding like eels, and Peter and Paul and a few of the other weekend sportsmen are casting in the upstream shallows for carp and suckers. And the quick release, arcing out over the spinning spool, pretending it's just looking, it's not buying, and the painted turtle rattle climbs up, the fish ladder which assists salmon in migrating upstream, and the forged hook drops deep into a quieted pool. Of course, a new feature not found in the original dam. Maybe they're all still there, in the Frilton store, awaiting their residency papers, or change from a 20, or further directions from the Jesuits. Maybe the women are growing corn, beans, and squash, having rigged up mirrors and garden hoses, and are now pounding their 3 sisters with chunks of white-tailed deer and passenger pigeons, feeding an entire nation with their fingers. Maybe the femur bones of the large mammals and the wishbones of the shorebirds and the nod cobs in the fire are the next big ash pocket of carbonized remains, out of which a new inventory of what plants had been eaten today will eventually be able to be conducted with some compensations. Maybe they're still there, in the Frilton store, passing the time napping Onondaga chert into points, stone chips flying at the windshields in the parking lot, leaving a telltale circle in the soil at their feet, a circle which looters and archaeologists and dealers will someday pick out like a hawk. Burned elements, butchering marks, animal gnaw marks, evidence of hunting in the form of projectile tips found embedded in the distal half of a right deer radius. A type IC22 tubular glass red bead. A good deal. a good deal. A good deal placed in the hand to consider in good faith. In good faith, all objects go to the hand of the vendor. So nicotined with cash, he won't meet our eye. For the price of one saved soul, he'll throw in the pair. Even undifferentiated metal artifacts, even those harbor a power to return us to the place of their making. The hand of the first maker still lives there too, still lives inside the things. The hand in its first mode of considering.
There isn't anything in the chat quite yet, but just a reminder to folks, if they want to turn on their cameras, I'll be happy to unmute you. Karen, I do have a question for you. As you started with the gesture and just ended with the gesture again, I was wondering if that came before the poem, or if the poem came and then the connection in your mind to the gesture, or was it sort of like an organic all-in-one?
I think the gesture came first. And I noticed that depending on the context I'm in, this, I'm going to say it's intelligence in my hand. My hand is searching for things. My fingertips know the difference between, let's say, one surface and the next, or one texture and the next. I can't read Braille, but that would also be in this. Like, I'm reading the world of objects with my fingers. And depending, and I'm not a pianist, and I don't read Braille, but there's other places where I feel like my hands are very smart and they can sure pick out something. So what would be an example? Good example. Picking green beans. So I'm a very good bean and berry picker. If anybody knows me and they need some bean and berry picking help, that's me. And there's lots of reasons why people are crappy berry pickers. One is they just eat them all. That's all right. One is that but the other one is they can't see them or feel them. It just looks like plants. And then you move on, it just looks like plants. And when I'm working at an urban farm, I have to teach the kids to not trust their eyes, because their eyes are showing them, like with the green plants, green beans, climbing beans, their eyes are showing them just a wall of green. But if I say, go in with your hands and feel about, rummage, and then they will encounter something underneath those. And the surprise on their face is just miraculous. So it's like the hands are learning to do something that the eyes can't quite do. So in that context, when I'm doing that, I feel like, oh, this is amazing. I'm picking vegetables for dinner. I'm teaching children how to discern with their fingertips. But then when you read, and so I'll take that into another context. Let's say when I'm on the beach, I'll be like looking for rocks and picking them out. And sometimes I'll be doing it with my fingers, because my fingers are really pleased with the smooth ones and it can differentiate them. I'm also a kind of amateur mycologist, and that is sort of reading in the like the mushrooms, you don't always see them. They're sometimes sort of slightly underneath and you have to sort of reach in. I suppose cooking, like baking bread, has some of that. Feeling for it with your actually feeling for it. And I've tried to teach people how to bake bread or bake pies, and they say they're hopeless because they can't feel. When I say, you feel how it's really like it's good right now because it's not falling apart, and they're just like, I can't. So think about all the different ways that your hands do something like this, and they're discerning. But then I also realized that in a different context, that's a way you could rip somebody off. It's a way you could do a kind of like sleight of hand magic trick, literally to like distract with one, take with the other. I started thinking about the Bible and how there are a number of stories in the Bible that have to do with the trading of hands, something that somebody takes and somebody gives. The tribute money, and Judas is a story about hands and things passing between hands. So the poem is really coming from my trying to reckon with what my hands are capable of doing, that it can maybe override my eyes, and maybe even find myself involved in some kind of rummaging that is not my business to be doing. So it's about all of those possibilities that come out of the power of the human hand to discern. I've probably missed some parts, but that's really what it is.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as you were talking, it was just out of the screen, but I was running my fingers on the cover of your book, and I know that we had talked before a little bit about the lovely job that Gasparo did on it, but that just means more to me now that like the book itself is so tactile in light of that poem. Yeah,
I'm very lucky to be working with Gasparo because they know that a book is an object with many dimensions of giving to it, and it's a tactile experience as much as it is a cognitive word processing experience. And I don't know if this is going to be, this might, let me just try this. This might be a big stretch, but I think that when I'm writing poetry, and I'm reading poetry, not even my own, but I'm reading lyric poetry that somebody else has written, I think my eyes and my mind are doing something like this. It's like they're feeling through the grain of meaning. They're following the grains of meaning. I was talking to my friend Steve last week, and he said something about how he's a carpenter. This is relevant. He's a woodworker. And he sent me a couple of words. He just said, oh, these words are so beautiful, not from my book, but just words in general. And I said, they have a beautiful grain. And he just went, exactly. You know, he spends his happy parts of his days getting to know particular pieces of wood and the unique grain that each piece of wood has, because each piece of wood lived in a different place and took up a different amount of nutrients and took in a different degree of water from every bit of wood is different, and his skill is discerning it and working with the grain of the wood to make something beautiful. He makes extremely beautiful furniture. And so I said, well, you're pleased with the word because you see it's got good grain. And that's really the way that I think. I'm not speaking metaphorically, is that words also have grain, and then sentences have grain and rhythm. And you can read a book of poetry then with a kind of discerning, like a sensuous discerning. It could be the light between it. It could be any other things, but it's not just strictly trying to figure out the metaphors and what they mean. You can move through the poems with a discernment. And I think it's in your spirit or your mind or whatever you want to call that. So that's maybe a physicalist, spiritual mashup of how poetry is. But I know that poems are working when I can feel that it's got a beautiful grain to it. And I'm not using my hands on the page, but I'm using something in me that is doing what my hands do. And there was a big challenge. I'll just end on this. There's a big challenge with this particular book. I think it goes back to the previous question about these three different parts that are woven in together. And I was working with the editor at Gasparo, Andrew Steves. He's really fantastic. And he said to me on a couple of occasions, there's just too much happening in this section of the page. I can't follow. It's like it's becoming chaotic. There's too much chaos. I can't figure it out. And then we tried this, we tried that, we tried this, we tried that, we tried this, we tried that. Trying to reduce the number of tangents or layers or middens that were at work in poems, because in almost every poem there are 3 or 4 layers of meaning that are working at the same time, and their references are moving around depending on whether you think I'm talking about a tree, if you think I'm talking about religion, or if you think I'm talking about something. They're there and you can follow one or the other. But sometimes there were just too much going on and I didn't quite know how to solve the problem. And Andrew said, let's try working with the line lengths on the pages to see if the line lengths themselves will give, will basically slow the flow of energy down on the page. So that connects back to something that Daniel said at the very beginning about eco-poetry. And it worked. The line breaks slow down the read, and they put a physical break. The energy in the meaning takes a bit of a quiet and then continues. And I also thought when I finally got the book in my hand that they are like, let me just get this right. They're performing in my words what weirs perform in rivers, is they oxygenate it. So it really does have to do with taking care with the material nature of poetry so that it's moving at the right speeds, so that the meaning that we're trying to find in it, it might have been put there by me, but it's also, there's many more meanings available that your hands can feel, that we can actually feel them. We're moving at the right pace to be able to see them, or we're letting our eyes not see so that we can feel with some other part of ourselves. So I'll leave it at that. I think there's a lot there to say. There's a physicalist kind of truth to poems. Poems are objects and they work like objects too.
I just wanted to make one comment because it's really a half-formed thought, but it goes with what you were saying. And then there is a question and a request, but we'll put it back to you to see with the 14 minutes. I can't believe there's only 14 minutes left. But I was looking at the hunter-gatherer, this page 60 and 61, and how the line lengths on the one side are much shorter than the line lengths on the other side, giving a sort of like asymmetry to reading it on the page. And given time after this, I feel like I'm just going to spend some time comparing what the poem is doing on both pages, because I just noticed that visually when I was paying attention to the pages this time and listening to you. So
well, that's right, you can put your attention in different places. Great.
So I do want to give space to this question from Ishani. Was there a particular environment you envisioned when you wrote this piece? For some reason, I see a farmer's market holding an object, then being taken back in time from that item, like a transition from urban to not so distant colonial past.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. I wanted to free the objects from the here and now, so that we could, and also free them from desiring, being like clutching for them, grabbing for them, so that they could sink back in our imaginaries, back through different histories and times and uses or non-uses. And so that's kind of amazing. And to the first hand, because you think about when something first came into being made, when it was made or unmade, there was some person putting their hand to it to make that bead, right? So yeah, just tracing things as they move forward, fall into the earth, never to be found again, dug up again, stolen. They're in some dusty case in somebody's house because they're stolen goods. Then the person dies, that gets thrown into a box lot. It gets auctioned off. Somebody buys it. They like the bead. They sew it into their kid's Halloween costume. It turns up in an earring. It goes down the gutter and never to be seen again, right? So I just enjoyed that following objects in this particular region takes us through different economies and peoples and times. And also that if you're a thief, use that in the largest sense, you have no intention of being fair with what your hands are doing. I find it incredible the kinds of skills that thieves have for spotting objects that are actually valuable and nobody's noticing. Like when you read those archaeological records, they can pick out, I mean, you go walk on a field now, after this, go walk on a field and try to read the field and see where in that there is some indicator that there might have been an encampment there, let's say. And the chances are we won't see it. But people who are trained can see it. They can walk and walk and walk, and they can see a small circle that is a circle rather than just an accidental circle. And what it is the sort of the distance that the chipping, when they're making like stone arrowheads, would go, and it forms a circle. And you can see, not everybody can see that, just like the kids can't see the beans. So objects also have maybe this power to call out the eyes, but not everybody's eyes. And that creates a space for theft. Yeah, for exploitation.
Brad is playing on that as well. He's asking now about the relationship between a poet and a thief, the person trained to recognize value.
Good one. Slightly terrifying question, Brad, but very good. I'm going to try to answer you short so I can read a poem.
Sure.
We're all involved in stealing. We're all taking things that don't belong to us. We're all going into places we have no right to go. And there's ways that truth is masked from us. So as an academic, we end up kind of getting caught up in like citation. Did you cite that right? Did you cite that right? If not, you've plagiarized. So one of the things that I did in this book, also then there's this other story. One story about colonialism will be that all the treaties and all the deals that were made, they were all ripoffs. They were just all ripoffs. And that can't be true either. Some of them actually had to have been fair exchanges and they were honored and honorable. So I wanted to show that, that these things, the same person who does something honorable might have in the dark of night put a headlamp on and gone and stolen the axes. And I think our history is also a history of both theft and violence, but also probably fair dealings and rule of law and respect for that. And not just that one belonged to one people's and the other was belonged to the other people's, but I think it's a more interesting mix in human nature and also how we hide one with the other. So I would say a poet is both a maker of something and also a thief, a stealer. Everything is just being recycled and taken from elsewhere. So the way that I wanted to indicate this, and this is a political book, it's a book about different histories and the lack of transparency about those histories, is this could get me in trouble. There are footnotes and citations in this book. And that's my good academic self saying, look, I'm a good, I respect intellectual property and I'm playing by all the rules and I'm a fair person.
Right.
But I don't actually do it all the time. There's lots of things I just rip right off. And so you need to know that when you're reading it too. And so maybe a footnote on page 13, which says this blah, blah, blah from Kristen and Sommer's epimictic something in the nature of biology. You're thinking, oh, wow, that's Houle. Like Houle's just, she's giving a nod where a nod is required to those scientists. 3 pages later, I just rip them right off. And I do that very deliberately to try to get a feel for the fact that we're not really as consistent as maybe we like to say we are on one side or the other. Also know some thieves that are actually really good people in some ways. So kind of going like that, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Time for one more poem. Are there requests? If there's one, I won't be able to read it because it's too long, but are there any other requests?
Yeah, there was one and it was for Oh, fish and game, or what is to be had, page 24.
Okay, that's an easy one. I can't read When North Flows South because it is 10 pages long. But fish or game, or what is to be had. We have, how much time do we have left? Just 6 minutes? All right.
That's right.
Good, not very long. And so everybody out there with their poet ears up, when I say what it means to be had on the, on the back of the poem that I just read. To be had means somebody's ripped you off. You are a fool. You were made a fool of. That's one sense of to be had. So what there is if you are to be had. But you can also use it in the other sense of what is to be had would be like, oh, I'm thinking about traveling to Mallorca. And what is there to be had in Mallorca? Which means like, what am I going to find there? What kind of delights to my bourgeois tourist needs are going to be met? So what is there to be had? And so this is just a little meditation on a is under the control of the Grand River Conservation Authority, which is like local government that that looks after the trees and the water and is responsible for certain areas along the Grand. They're not privatized, the Conservation Authority. So this is a kind of found poem. Some of it is a found poem from the Grand River Conservation Authority's brochures that they hand out to folks who want to go canoe or fish on the Grand River in this section. Fish and game, or what is to be had. Remember, the riverbanks and floodplain lands are privately owned. Camping in a farmer's field without written permission is a violation of the Trespass Act. Excellent meals can be provided on board daytime and evening cruising about the River Bell in summer months with advance reservations. After the survey, after the full extent of the river discovered, it was decided to limit the extent of Indian land from the mouth. No conflict with these activities will be encountered all along the river's edge. Recreation is to be had. I'm going to close with one more quick one, okay? If that's all right. We have 3 minutes. I don't want to say it's a 3-minute poem. I'm undoing my promise about slowing down. It's interesting to me. These have mostly been about human histories and the rivers playing a role, or the lakes are playing a role, but it's much more sort of an archaeological little transect we've taken here. Okay, I'm going to end today's reading, our visits together all around the globe, actually, which is amazing. I've never had a poetry reading where there's people all over the globe. So I'm going to read Elm. Elm is a sort of tree. It's a tree that largely died out in the last century here because it was killed by Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease was carried by a beetle. And I think all the time about parasites and fungi and viruses and bacteria that are carried from one part of the world into another. We're dealing with the pandemic, which is basically that writ large. And in our part of the world, so many of the what are called native tree species, including the elm, which is called Ulmus americana, even the sort of botanical names we give them say something about the politics of the time when they were named, Ulmus americana, because they're older than the Americas, that's for sure. But elm is largely non-existent, although there are 2 on the University of Guelph campus, and they're very, very special. But the trees make their disappearance. And when trees make their disappearance, then the peoples and the creatures and the fungi that were in symbiotic relationships, either through the housing material or foodstuffs or shelter with that particular tree, because it would have been chosen, not just any old tree will do, then there's also going to be the disappearance. So one thing never just disappears. There are these kind of constellations of ecological vitalities that go. So if the elm goes, the peoples that depended upon the elms, the creatures that lived in the elms, they are displaced and they have to find another place, or they have to survive that onslaught, and they have to, and often that's not true. So the elm. Those of you who don't know this area, there's an Indian village up on the Niagara Escarpment, not far from here, in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and it's called Crawford Lake. Very, very important trading site. And you can go now in current day, you can go to Crawford Lake, and there's a reconstruction of a small Indian village, including the housing type that was typical of the peoples in this area, which they're called the peoples of the long house. So it's like a long covered house. What else do we know? That many of the first peoples of this area also perished because of viruses and bacteria and diseases that were brought unwittingly in on the objects that were traded and the peoples with whom they traded. Okay, elm. The epigram is from one of my favorite ethical philosophers named Emmanuel Levinas, and this is from a book he wrote called On Escape. And Levinas writes, when everything has disappeared, everything that has disappeared appears. This is the other night. Elm. The fully reconstructed longhouse on display at Crawford Lake is buck naked. So quiet as if uninhabited. Footnote 1. Remark made by Samuel de Champlain or Jean de Brébeuf upon approaching a fully occupied Mohawk 4-fire longhouse. So quiet as if uninhabited. Her roomy sternum is exposed elm saplings, sheath-lashed, hunched over, a 4-family fire, a triple palisade heart, no cord blood, no spine pole, no needing to support her outer membrane. Percussion-driven, pressure flaking, a rubbing and the blowing on, the cross hatched on the wet lip with a cord-wrapped stick, the punctate, the precise incision. The laying out flat on the ironing and the cutting into cooling white flesh. Is a man with a burning head sweeping upstate with the Dutch cough, thus ending the supply of elm bark, is what the key gouged legend reads. For those of you who don't know what the page looked, that's what it looks like with the footnote at the bottom. Sometimes I read the footnote and sometimes I don't, but I like Brad's tough question, so I put it in. All right, I'm done from my end. Questions, comments from Victoria?
Just a ha from Brad at your comment, but nothing in the chat at this time. But most folks who joined us at the beginning are still here. They're really holding on. So that's great. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here and sticking around. Yes, there's comments coming in. Ishani, your poems really moved and inspired them. And thank you so much for this reading and discussion from Kevin.
Kevin, thank you.
Read this collection last summer. It was lovely to revisit. Peter, as a composer, I would like to discuss music and poetry. I've set many poems. I see the true genius of a poem only as I set it to music. Another time.
Thanks, Peter.
So maybe Daniel, if you want to join us back up on camera.
That would be
and great. I will let Daniel take us out. But like, super thanks, Karen. Thank you for letting me be part of this. It's such a pleasure that as part of my work, I get to work with people like Daniel and hear from people like you. So this was a beautiful hour and a half spent that I'm very grateful for.
Thanks, Victoria.
Unmute Daniel there.
Yeah.
That was a beautiful reading, Karen. Thank you so much. It's one of the finest readings I think I've ever heard. I just wanted to finish with a quotation from Peter Berg's Planet Realm homepage. Because it is a cultural idea, the description of a specific bioregion is drawn using information from not only natural sciences, but also many sources. It is a geographical terrain and a terrain of consciousness. Anthropological studies, historic accounts, social developments, customs, traditions, and arts all take a part. Poets, painters, theater groups, and other artists have embraced bioregional themes in their works. So there's another whole discussion that Peter just introduced as a composer, is how certain arts are specific to bioregions, you know, how the development of arts within specific bioregions reflect the unique character of those bioregions. That's another whole discussion. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Beautiful. All right, I'm going to wave goodbye. The sun went down as we were working together, but it's a little bit longer every day. So that's a very special part about being in the north, right? Is you get a little less sun and then you get a little bit more sun.